It all started when Sarah moved into her new apartment building. She was excited to start fresh in the city, leaving behind her small-town life for the thrill and opportunities that awaited her. The building was old but charming, with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings. She loved the large windows that let in plenty of sunlight during the day, making her small space feel bigger. Sarah's apartment was on the third floor, apartment 304. She quickly settled in, enjoying the quiet and friendly atmosphere of the building. Most of the neighbors kept to themselves, but she occasionally exchanged polite smiles and greetings with them in the hallways. It was a peaceful place to live, or so she thought. One evening, about a week after she moved in, Sarah noticed a man standing in front of apartment 302, directly across from hers. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and deep-set eyes. He wore an old, worn-out coat even though it was warm outside. His appearance struck her as odd, but she didn't think much of it at the time. People had their quirks after all. The man seemed to be struggling with his keys, fumbling for several minutes before finally managing to open his door. Sarah offered a friendly smile and a quick hello, but he didn't respond. Instead, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable, before slipping inside his apartment. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Sarah feeling slightly unsettled. As days passed, Sarah noticed the man more frequently. He never seemed to leave his apartment during the day. The only time she saw him was late at night, often in the hallway, standing in front of his door as if he was waiting for something or someone. He always seemed to be watching, though never directly. Whenever she caught his gaze, he would quickly look away, disappearing into his apartment. Despite her growing unease, Sarah tried to ignore him. Maybe he was just shy or had a different schedule. But then, strange things started happening. She began hearing odd noises coming from apartment 302, soft whispers, faint footsteps, and the sound of something dragging across the floor. The noises always started late at night, just when she was trying to fall asleep. Sarah's sleep was increasingly disturbed by the noises from next door. She would lie awake, listening to the soft thuds and whispers, her mind racing with questions. What was he doing in there? Why did he only come out at night? The more she thought about it, the more her curiosity grew. One night, after another restless evening, Sarah decided to do something she had never done before. She pressed her ear against the wall that separated her apartment from his. The wall was old and thin, allowing her to hear more clearly. The sounds were unmistakable. Someone was moving around in there, pacing back and forth. Occasionally she heard what sounded like muffled voices, but it was hard to make out any words. The next morning, as she left for work, she saw him again. This time he was standing in the hallway, staring at her door as if he had been waiting for her to come out. His eyes were hollow, and his face looked even more gaunt than before. A shiver ran down her spine as she walked past him, muttering a quick, "Good morning." He didn't reply. That evening, Sarah returned home to find a small note slipped under her door. The paper was old and yellowed, with spidery handwriting scrawled across it. The note read, "Stop listening." She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. How did he know? Was he somehow aware that she had been listening through the wall? Fear gripped her as she glanced at his door, which was slightly ajar. She could see a sliver of darkness beyond it, but no sign of the man. The note left Sarah feeling more anxious than ever. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? That her neighbor was acting strange, that she had been eavesdropping on him. It didn't seem like enough to warrant their attention, so she decided to confront him herself. The next night, Sarah gathered her courage and knocked on his door. There was no response at first, just the usual silence. She was about to turn away when the door slowly creaked open. The man stood there, his hollow eyes staring into hers. "Is there something you need?" he asked in a voice that was barely above a whisper. It was the first time she had heard him speak, and it sent chills down her spine. I wanted to ask if everything is okay," Sarah stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've heard some noises coming from your apartment, and I just wanted to make sure you're all right." For a moment he said nothing, just continued to stare at her with those unsettling eyes. Then he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. "Come in," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Every instinct told Sarah to turn around and leave, but something compelled her to step inside. The apartment was dark and cold, with the curtains drawn tightly shut. The air was thick with a strange, musty odor, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb in the corner. As she stepped further into the room, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked like red chalk. In the center of the room was a large circular rug with more symbols etched into it. The man stood by the door, watching her closely. "What is this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "This is where I keep them," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "They come at night. They need a place to stay." Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Who are they?" "They're here," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They're always here." Sarah's fear intensified as she took in the room. The symbols on the walls and the rug seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. She could feel something in the air, something dark and oppressive pressing down on her. The man stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They don't like strangers." What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Who are they?" "The spirits," he replied, his eyes darting around the room as if he was looking for something or someone. "They're trapped here. I try to keep them calm, but they're restless." Sarah felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. You need help. This isn't right." The man shook his head slowly. "No one can help me. I'm the only one who can keep them contained if they get out." He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood the implication. She took a step back, her mind racing. She needed to get out of there, but the man was blocking the door. "I think I should go," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man's eyes narrowed. "You can't leave now. They've seen you." Before Sarah could react, the lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. She felt a cold hand grasp her wrist and she screamed, trying to pull away, but the grip was strong, holding her in place. "You have to stay," the man whispered, his voice right next to her ear. "You're part of this now." Sarah's mind was racing. She knew she had to get out of that apartment, but the man's grip on her wrist was like a vice. She struggled against him, trying to wrench herself free, but he was surprisingly strong for someone so thin and gaunt. "You can't leave," he repeated, his voice a low growl. "They'll follow you." With a burst of adrenaline, Sarah kicked out, aiming for his shins. The man grunted in pain and loosened his grip just enough for her to pull away. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest as she reached for the door. But the room was still pitch black, and she couldn't see where she was going. Suddenly she felt something cold and clammy brush against her arm. She let out a terrified scream and bolted for the door, her hands groping in the darkness. She finally found the doorknob and twisted it frantically, praying that it wasn't locked. The door swung open and she stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. The lights were on out here, and the familiar sight of her own apartment door across the hall was a relief. She didn't look back as she ran to her door, fumbling with her keys. As she unlocked her door and rushed inside, she slammed it shut behind her, leaning against it as she tried to calm her racing heart. She could still hear the man's voice in her head, his chilling words echoing in her mind. "You're part of this now." She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat on her couch, every light in her apartment on, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The images of the symbols on the walls, the strange, oppressive atmosphere of the apartment, and the man's haunting words played over and over in her mind. The next morning, Sarah decided she couldn't stay in the building any longer. She packed her bags, determined to leave and never come back. But as she was about to step out of her apartment, she heard a knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat as she approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. When she opened it, she was surprised to see a police officer standing there. "Are you Sarah?" the officer asked, looking at a piece of paper in his hand. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry to bother you, but we're investigating a disturbance reported by one of your neighbors. They said they heard screaming from your apartment last night. Is everything all right?" Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had happened. But before she could say anything, the officer spoke again. "We also received a call about apartment 302. The tenant there hasn't been seen in a few days. Do you know anything about that?" Sarah's blood ran cold. She hadn't seen the man since she escaped from his apartment. Had something happened to him, or was he still in there, waiting for her? The officer must have noticed the look on her face because he asked, "Do you want to come with me while I check it out?" Sarah nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and curiosity. She followed the officer across the hall to apartment 302. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. After a few moments, he tried the doorknob, and to Sarah's surprise, the door creaked open. The apartment was exactly as she remembered it, dark, cold, and filled with that strange, musty odor. The symbols were still on the walls, but there was no sign of the man. "Hello?" the officer called out, stepping inside. "Is anyone here?" There was no response. The officer turned to Sarah, his expression serious. "Stay here. I'm going to check the other rooms." Sarah nodded, staying just outside the door as the officer disappeared into the darkness. She could hear him moving around, opening doors and checking closets. After what felt like an eternity, he returned to the front door, a puzzled look on his face. "There's no one here," he said, shaking his head. "But there's something off about this place. I'll have to file a report and get someone to look into it." Sarah didn't know what to say. She felt a sense of relief, but also a lingering fear that the man wasn't really gone. As she watched the officer close the door to apartment 302, she knew she couldn't stay in the building any longer. Without another word, she went back to her apartment, grabbed her bags, and left. She didn't look back as she walked down the stairs and out of the building. All she wanted was to put as much distance between herself and that place as possible. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still watching her, waiting for her to return, and somewhere deep inside she knew that she would never truly be free of him. Tom had always been a night owl, enjoying the quiet solitude that came after the sun went down. His job as a freelance graphic designer allowed him to work odd hours, and he often found himself awake deep into the night. His apartment building was usually silent during those hours, with most of his neighbors fast asleep. But that all changed when a new tenant moved into the apartment across the hall. Tom first noticed him late one night while he was taking out the trash. As he stepped into the dimly lit hallway, he saw a figure standing in front of the door to apartment 7B. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the shadows. He wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, hiding his features. Tom gave a polite nod as he passed, but the man didn't acknowledge him. He just stood there, staring at the door. Something about the man made Tom uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that the new neighbor was watching him, even though he never saw the man's face. Over the next few days, Tom noticed the man more often. He was always in the hallway late at night, standing in the same spot, never saying a word. It was as if he was waiting for something or someone. One night, as Tom was working on a project, he heard a strange noise coming from the hallway. It was a soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. He paused, listening intently, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. Curiosity got the better of him, and he opened his apartment door just a crack to see what was going on. The hallway was empty, but the door to apartment 7B was slightly ajar. A faint light flickered inside, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Tom hesitated, unsure if he should investigate further, but his curiosity got the better of him. He stepped out into the hallway, moving quietly toward the open door. As he peered inside, he saw the new neighbor standing in the middle of the living room. The room was sparsely furnished, with only a few pieces of old, worn furniture. The man's back was turned to Tom, and he seemed to be staring at something on the floor. Tom craned his neck, trying to see what it was, but the man shifted slightly, blocking his view. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. There was something off about the whole situation, and his instincts were screaming at him to leave. But before he could back away, the man turned around, his eyes locking onto Tom's. They were cold and empty, like twin black voids that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. Tom quickly retreated to his apartment, closing the door behind him with a trembling hand. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process what he had just seen. The man's eyes had been so unnatural, so devoid of any emotion. Tom couldn't shake the image from his mind, and he spent the rest of the night wide awake, every creak and groan of the building making him jump. The next day, Tom tried to convince himself that he was overreacting. Maybe the man was just tired, or maybe it was a trick of the light. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't banish the unease that gnawed at him. Every time he left his apartment, he felt like he was being watched. And more than once he caught a glimpse of the man out of the corner of his eye. The strange noises continued as well. Every night, just as Tom was getting ready for bed, he would hear that same scraping sound followed by soft, almost inaudible whispers. It was as if someone or something was moving around in the apartment next door, but whenever Tom gathered the courage to look, the hallway was empty, and the door to apartment 7B was closed. Tom's work began to suffer as his sleep became more and more disturbed. He found himself making mistakes, missing deadlines, and snapping at his clients. His friends noticed the change in him too, commenting on how tired and stressed he looked. Tom tried to explain what was happening, but he could tell they didn't believe him. They chalked it up to stress and suggested he take a break, but Tom knew it was more than that. The final straw came one night, when Tom heard a loud crash coming from the apartment next door. It was followed by a series of frantic footsteps and muffled voices. Tom's heart raced as he grabbed his phone, ready to call the police. But before he could dial the number, there was a knock at his door. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Tom slowly approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. He took a deep breath and opened it, half expecting to see the man standing there, his cold, empty eyes staring back at him. But the hallway was empty. Tom's blood ran cold as he stepped out, looking around for any sign of the man. The door to apartment 7B was slightly ajar again, the faint light flickering inside. He could hear the whispers louder now, more distinct, but still impossible to understand. Gathering his courage, Tom pushed the door open and stepped inside. As Tom entered the apartment, the first thing he noticed was the smell. It was a foul, rotten stench that made him gag. The living room was empty, just as he had seen it before, but there was something different this time. The furniture had been pushed aside, and in the center of the room was a large, dark stain on the floor. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the stain, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it blood? Had something happened to the new neighbor? He knelt down to get a closer look, but before he could touch it, he heard a noise behind him. He spun around, his eyes widening in horror. The man was standing in the doorway, his face twisted into a grotesque grin. His eyes were wild, filled with a madness that made Tom's blood run cold. In his hand, the man held a large, rusty knife, the blade stained with something dark. "They didn't want to leave," the man whispered, his voice trembling with barely contained excitement. "But I made them. I made them leave." Tom backed away, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body was frozen in place. The man took a step forward, his grin widening as he raised the knife. "You'll join them," he hissed. "You'll stay with them forever." Tom's paralysis broke, and he turned and ran for the door. He could hear the man's footsteps behind him, but he didn't dare look back. He bolted out of the apartment and down the hallway, not stopping until he was outside the building. He didn't stop running until he was several blocks away, his lungs burning and his legs shaking. Tom didn't go back to his apartment that night. He checked into a hotel and called the police, telling them everything he had seen. They took his statement seriously, but when they went to investigate, they found no sign of the man or the stain on the floor. The apartment was completely empty, and the landlord claimed that the unit had been vacant for months. Tom couldn't believe it. He knew what he had seen, what he had heard, but the police dismissed it as a misunderstanding, suggesting that Tom might have been hallucinating due to stress and lack of sleep. They offered to help him find a counselor, but Tom refused. He wasn't crazy, he knew what had happened. He moved out of the building the next day, leaving behind everything he couldn't carry with him. He didn't care about his belongings. He just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. But even after he moved to a new city, the memories haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, watching, waiting for him to return. Tom never found out what had really happened in that apartment, and he never wanted to. All he knew was that he had come too close to something dark, something evil, and he had barely escaped with his life. Years passed, and Tom eventually rebuilt his life. He found a new job, made new friends, and even started sleeping through the night again. But the experience in apartment 7B had left a permanent scar on his psyche. He couldn't stay in one place for too long, always feeling the urge to move, to escape. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, expecting to see the man standing in the shadows, waiting for him. One day, while browsing the internet, Tom stumbled upon an article about haunted places. His curiosity piqued. He clicked on the link and began reading. As he scrolled through the list of locations, his heart stopped when he saw a familiar address. It was his old apartment building. According to the article, the building had a long history of strange occurrences and unexplained deaths. The most notorious of these was the case of a man who had lived in apartment 7B. The article claimed that the man had gone insane and killed several of his neighbors before disappearing without a trace. His victims were never found, and the apartment had been vacant ever since. Tom's blood ran cold as he read the article. The man he had encountered was real. He had been living in a place marked by tragedy and madness. The article went on to say that some believed the man's spirit still haunted the building, looking for new victims to add to his collection. Tom closed the article, his hands shaking. He knew he had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, and as he sat there staring at the screen, he made a silent vow to never return to that place, to never speak of it again. But deep down, he knew that no matter how far he ran, he would never truly be free of the shadows that had followed him from apartment 7B. Lily had been living in her apartment building for nearly a year before she noticed anything strange. The building was old, with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it had a certain charm that she loved. The other tenants were friendly, if a bit reserved, and she had never had any issues with them until she started hearing the noises. It began one night when Lily was up late working on a project. The noise was faint at first, just a soft thumping coming from somewhere below her. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the old building settling, but the noise persisted. It grew louder and more rhythmic, like someone knocking on a door. Curious, Lily got up and went to the door of her apartment. She pressed her ear against it, listening. The sound was definitely coming from the hallway, but it seemed to be coming from below her. She lived on the second floor, and the only thing below her was the basement. Lily's building had a basement, but she had never been down there. It was used mostly for storage, and the landlord had warned her that it wasn't safe to go down there alone. The basement was old and prone to flooding, and there had been reports of strange smells and odd noises coming from it over the years, but the noise was persistent, and Lily's curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed a flashlight from her drawer and headed out into the hallway. The sound grew louder as she approached the door to the basement stairs, and she hesitated for a moment before opening it. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, and the air grew colder as she descended. The noise was louder now, echoing off the concrete walls. It sounded like someone, or something, was moving around down there. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, Lily shone her flashlight around the room. The basement was just as she had imagined it, damp, musty, and filled with old furniture and boxes. But there was something else, too. Something that made her heart skip a beat. In the far corner of the basement, barely visible in the dim light, was a door. It was old and weathered, with peeling paint and rusted hinges. The noise was coming from behind that door. Lily's first instinct was to turn around and go back upstairs. The door had a sinister feel to it, and the thought of what might be behind it sent a chill down her spine. But her curiosity wouldn't let her leave without at least taking a closer look. She approached the door cautiously, her flashlight beam flickering as she moved. The noise was clearer now, thumping followed by a dragging sound. It was as if something was trying to escape from behind the door. When she reached the door, Lily hesitated again. The handle was old and rusty, and she could see cobwebs clinging to the corners. She took a deep breath and reached out, grasping the handle with a trembling hand. It was locked. Relief washed over her, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The door was locked. Whatever was behind it couldn't get out. But as she turned to leave, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but there was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was whispering her name from behind the door. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the door. She turned and ran up the stairs, not stopping until she was safely back in her apartment. She locked the door behind her and sat down on her bed, trying to calm her racing heart. What had she heard? Was it her imagination, or was there really something or someone trapped in the basement? The next morning, Lily couldn't stop thinking about the door in the basement. She wanted to ask the landlord about it, but she didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, she decided to talk to one of her neighbors, Mrs. Henderson, who had lived in the building for over 30 years. Lily knocked on Mrs. Henderson's door, and the elderly woman answered with a warm smile. "Lily, dear, what brings you by?" Lily hesitated, unsure of how to broach the subject. "Mrs. Henderson, have you ever heard strange noises coming from the basement?" Mrs. Henderson's smile faded, and she glanced around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "Why do you ask?" Lily explained what had happened the night before, leaving out the part about the whispering voice. Mrs. Henderson listened quietly, her expression growing more serious with each word. When Lily finished, Mrs. Henderson sighed. "I've heard those noises too, dear. Many of us have. But we don't talk about it. It's better not to stir things up." "What do you mean?" Lily asked. Her curiosity piqued. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There's something wrong with this building, Lily. The basement especially. There's been talk over the years, stories about people who've gone down there and never come back. The landlord keeps it locked up for a reason. Lily felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think it's haunted?" Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "I don't know what it is, but it's not something you want to mess with. My advice to you, dear, is to stay away from that basement. Don't go poking around where you don't belong." Lily nodded, feeling a sense of unease settle over her. She thanked Mrs. Henderson for the warning and went back to her apartment, her mind racing with possibilities. What was behind that door? And why did it seem like everyone in the building was afraid to talk about it? Lily tried to follow Mrs. Henderson's advice, but the noise from the basement didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder and more insistent. Every night, the thumping and dragging sounds echoed through the building, keeping Lily awake and filling her with a growing sense of dread. One night, the noise was particularly loud, and Lily couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her flashlight and headed back to the basement, determined to figure out what was going on. She knew it was dangerous, but her curiosity had become too strong to ignore. When she reached the basement, the noise was deafening. It sounded like something was pounding on the door, trying to break free. Lily's hands trembled as she approached the door, her flashlight flickering in the darkness. The door was still locked, but the noise was so loud that it felt like the door might burst open at any moment. Lily pressed her ear against the door, trying to make out any words in the whispers, but all she could hear was a low, menacing growl. Suddenly, the pounding stopped, and the basement fell silent. Lily held her breath, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, she heard a click, the sound of the lock on the door turning. The door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black room beyond. Lily's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work, but it was no use. Then, from the darkness, she heard the whisper again. This time it was louder, more insistent, and it sent a wave of terror through her. "Lily!" Lily turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the silent basement. She didn't stop until she was back in her apartment. The door locked securely behind her. She collapsed onto her bed, her heart racing and her mind spinning with fear. The next morning, Lily knew she couldn't stay in the building any longer. She packed her bags and made arrangements to move out as soon as possible. But before she left, she decided to do some research on the building's history. What she found shocked her. The building had been the site of several mysterious disappearances over the years, all of them linked to the basement. Tenants who had gone down there had never been seen again, and their belongings had been found abandoned in their apartments. The landlord had kept the basement locked ever since, but the noises had never stopped. Lily realized that she had come dangerously close to becoming one of those missing tenants. She shuddered at the thought of what might have happened if she had stayed in that basement any longer. As she left the building for the last time, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to return, but she knew she would never go back. She had escaped the basement dweller's grasp, and she intended to keep it that way. But even as she walked away, she couldn't forget the sound of that whisper, echoing in her mind. "Lily." When Jenna moved to the city for her new job, she was excited but nervous. She didn't know anyone in town, and finding a place to live had been harder than she expected. So when she found an affordable apartment with a roommate, she jumped at the opportunity. Her roommate, Claire, was friendly and easy to get along with. She was a little older than Jenna, in her early 30s, and had lived in the apartment for several years. Claire was a nurse and worked long hours, often leaving Jenna alone in the apartment for most of the day. At first, everything seemed perfect. Jenna loved the apartment, and she and Claire got along well. But it wasn't long before Jenna started noticing strange things happening around the apartment. It started with small things, objects moving around when she wasn't looking, lights flickering on and off, and strange noises in the middle of the night. Jenna tried to brush it off, blaming it on the old building or her imagination, but the incidents became more frequent and harder to ignore. One night, Jenna was in the kitchen making dinner when she heard a noise behind her. She turned around, expecting to see Claire, but the room was empty. She shrugged it off and went back to cooking, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Later that night, as she was getting ready for bed, Jenna heard a soft knock on her bedroom door. She opened it, but there was no one there. Confused, she called out for Claire, but there was no response. Jenna walked down the hall to Claire's room and knocked on the door. When there was no answer, she slowly opened the door and peeked inside. The room was empty, and the bed was neatly made. Claire wasn't home. Jenna felt a chill run down her spine. She was sure she had heard someone knock on her door, but there was no one there. She closed Claire's door and quickly went back to her own room, locking the door behind her. That night, Jenna couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old building. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and she couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over her. The next day, Jenna mentioned the strange occurrences to Claire, hoping for some reassurance. Claire listened patiently, but her response was unsettling. "I've noticed some weird things too," Claire admitted, her voice low, "but I try not to think about it. This building is old, and old buildings have their quirks." Jenna wasn't satisfied with that explanation, but she didn't press the issue. She tried to go about her day as usual, but the strange occurrences continued. More objects moved on their own. Doors opened and closed by themselves, and the strange noises at night grew louder. One evening, Jenna was in the living room watching TV when she heard a noise coming from Claire's room. It sounded like someone moving around, but Claire wasn't home. Jenna paused the TV and listened, her heart pounding in her chest. The noise stopped, and Jenna slowly got up and walked to Claire's room. The door was ajar, and she could see a faint light coming from inside. Jenna pushed the door open, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty, just as it had been the night before. But the light was coming from Claire's bedside lamp, which was flickering on and off. Jenna hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the lamp and turned it off. As soon as she did, the room fell into darkness, and Jenna felt a cold breeze brush past her. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the room was empty. Panicked, Jenna ran out of the room and locked herself in her bedroom. She could feel her heart racing, and her mind was filled with fear. What was happening in the apartment? Was it haunted? And if so, by what? Jenna couldn't take it anymore. She decided to do some research on the apartment building, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. What she found sent a chill down her spine. The apartment building had a dark history. It had been the site of several unexplained deaths over the years, and there were rumors of strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions. The most disturbing part was that all of the incidents had taken place in the same apartment, Jenna and Claire's apartment. According to the reports, a young woman had lived in the apartment several years ago. She had been found dead in her room under mysterious circumstances, and her death had never been fully explained. Since then, every tenant who had lived in the apartment had reported strange occurrences, and many had moved out after only a few months. Jenna's hands trembled as she read the reports. Was the apartment really haunted by the spirit of the dead woman? And if so, why was she still there? Jenna knew she had to tell Claire about what she had found, but she was scared. What if Claire didn't believe her? What if the spirit was dangerous? That night, Jenna couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. She kept hearing strange noises coming from the apartment, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. At around 3 a.m., Jenna heard a soft knock on her door. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The knock came again, louder this time. Jenna slowly got out of bed and walked to the door. She reached for the handle, but hesitated. What if it wasn't Claire? What if it was something else? The knock came again, and Jenna took a deep breath and opened the door. To her relief, it was Claire standing on the other side of the door. But something was wrong. Claire looked pale and frightened, and her eyes were wide with terror. "Jenna, we need to talk," Claire said, her voice shaking. "I've been hearing things too, and I think there's something in this apartment." Jenna nodded, feeling a surge of relief that she wasn't alone in this. She invited Claire into her room, and the two of them sat down on the bed, talking in hushed tones. Claire admitted that she had been experiencing strange occurrences ever since Jenna had moved in. She had tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away, but the incidents had only gotten worse. Claire confessed that she had even seen a ghostly figure in her room on more than one occasion. A young woman with long, dark hair and a pale face. Jenna felt a chill run down her spine. The description matched the young woman who had died in the apartment all those years ago. Was it possible that her spirit was still trapped in the apartment, unable to move on? The two women decided to do something about it. They researched ways to cleanse the apartment of any negative energy, and decided to perform a smudging ritual using sage. They hoped that it would be enough to send the spirit on its way. The next evening, they gathered all the necessary supplies and began the ritual. They walked through each room, burning the sage and reciting a prayer for peace. As they moved through the apartment, the atmosphere grew lighter, and the oppressive feeling that had been hanging over them began to lift. But just as they were finishing the ritual, something unexpected happened. The lights flickered, and a cold wind swept through the apartment, extinguishing the sage. Jenna and Claire froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The temperature in the room dropped, and they could see their breath in the air. Then, from the corner of the room, they heard a soft, ghostly whisper. "Help me." Jenna and Claire stared at each other, fear etched on their faces. The voice was faint, but there was no mistaking it. The spirit was still there, and she was reaching out to them for help. Jenna and Claire knew they couldn't leave the spirit trapped in the apartment any longer. They decided to contact a local medium who specialized in spirit communication and cleansing. The medium arrived the next day and performed a thorough cleansing of the apartment. She explained that the spirit of the young woman had been trapped in the apartment because of the traumatic way she had died. The spirit was lost and confused, unable to find peace. With the medium's guidance, Jenna and Claire helped the spirit find her way to the other side. The medium performed a ritual to guide the spirit into the light, and as the ritual progressed, Jenna and Claire could feel the atmosphere in the apartment change. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling that had haunted them for so long began to dissipate. Finally, the medium announced that the spirit had moved on. The apartment was quiet, and the feeling of being watched was gone. Jenna and Claire thanked the medium and said their final goodbyes to the young woman who had once been trapped in their home. As they stood in the now peaceful apartment, Jenna felt a sense of closure. The strange occurrences had stopped, and the spirit was finally at rest. She and Claire could now move on with their lives, free from the fear that had once consumed them. But as they turned to leave, Jenna thought she heard a soft, gentle whisper. One last goodbye from the spirit who had once shared their home. And in that moment, she knew that they had done the right thing. The apartment was no longer haunted, and the spirit was finally at peace.